In this video, you will learn about graphing linear inequalities in two variables.
First, let's review the steps for graphing inequalities with two variables. First, you're going to solve for y so that the inequality is in mx plus b form, or slope-intercept form. Then you're going to plot the y-intercept and use the slope to plot more points. And then this is the part that varies. Then you're going to draw in the appropriate line. So if you have a greater than or less than symbol, you're going to draw a dashed line. And if you have a greater than or equal to or less than or equal to symbol, you're going to draw a solid line. Lastly, you have to shade the appropriate region. So if you have a greater than or equal to symbol, you're going to shade above. And you have a less than or equal to symbol, you will shade below the line.
Now, the two most important things that you take away from these steps is the line type and the shading above or below, because that's what really is different from graphing a line. In order to determine the line type, we have to look at the symbol. So if our symbol is greater than or less than, meaning that there's no line under it, then you use the dashed line. Versus if I use greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, meaning there's a line under it to represent it could be equal to it, then you would use the solid line. The other thing is to remember when you have to shade above versus below. Now, when we have something that is greater than or equal to, you'll notice the key word is greater than, and you're shading above. So essentially, you can think greater means above. And if it's less than or equal to, you would shade below, which also makes sense. So I can say that less means below. And also, to help us remember, we can see that these less than symbols almost look, you took like the letter L and you turned it sideways. So to help us remember, the less than symbols look like a tilted L shape, which means less than. So you would shade below. The next two slides will provide examples where y is already isolated or by itself.
Now let's try our first example. So we're going to graph the inequality y is greater than 3/2 x plus 1. So in this case, it's already solved for y, so it's in our mx plus b form. This means that the slope, or the value for m, equals 3/2, and the y-intercept, or the b value, is 1. And remember that we're always going to start with the y-intercept. So I plot my y-intercept at +1, and I move using my slope, because slope is always in the form of rise over run. So I'm going to go up 3 and over 2 and plot my new point. Now, since the inequality symbol was greater than, this tells us first that we're going to have a dashed line. So I'm going to draw my line through this point using the ruler so that it's dashed. I'm going to draw my arrows at both sides. Also, since it is greater than, we're going to shade above the line. So if I look at my line, I want to shade the top part. So I'm going to shade in this part of my graph. Now let's try the next example. This example is also already solved for that y, so it's in mx plus b form. So the slope, or the m value, is -1/2, and the y-intercept, or the b value, is 3. So that means I'm going to start my point with my y-intercept at 3, and since my slope is rise over run, I'm going to go down 1 and over 2, since it's negative. So I go down 1 over 2 and plot my new point. Now, since the inequality symbol is less than or equal to, this tells me two pieces of information. First, it tells me that we're going to have a solid line. So I'll use my ruler to draw in the solid line. And then it tells me that since it's less than, that we're going to shade below. So if I look at my line, I'm going to shade everything below it.
The next two slides will provide examples where you have to rearrange the inequality, also known as solving for y first.
Now let's try our first example. So it says to graph the two-variable inequality. First thing we have to do is solve to get y by itself. So in order to do so, I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. So my inequality will become y is less than -2x plus 4. So now it's in that mx plus b form. And I can use this to determine that the slope, or the value for m, is -2, and the y-intercept, or the value of b, is 4. And remember, we're going to start by graphing the y-intercept. So I can plot my point at 0, 4, and then I'm going to determine the next point using the slope. And remember that since the slope is -2, I can really rewrite this as -2 over 1. And remember that slope is rise over run. So I'm going to go down 2 and over 1 and plot my new point. Now if I look back at the inequality that we're graphing, the inequality symbol is less than. So I can use this to determine that we're going to use a dashed line. So I can draw in my line using a ruler through the points. And I can also determine that since it's less than, we're going to shade below. So I'm going to shade everything below the line. In our next example, we're again going to graph the two-variable inequality. So we have to solve to get y by itself. So I'm first going to subtract 4x from both sides. So I'll -2y is less than -4x plus 6. And to finish getting y by itself, I have to divide everything on both sides by -2. However, in this case, since I am dividing everything by a negative number, this means that you're going to have to flip the inequality sign. So it will become y. We flip the sign, so instead of being less than, it becomes greater than negative 4 divided by negative 2 becomes positive 2x, and 6 divided by negative 2 becomes minus 3. Now from this point I can graph. So since this is already in that mx plus b form, I can determine that the slope, or the value of m, is 2, and the y-intercept, or the b value, is negative 3. So I can plot my point for the y-intercept at negative 3, and since my slope is 2, that means it's really 2 over 1. And using rise over run, I'm going to go up 2 and over 1 and plot my new point. Now we need to figure out the rest of the graph. So if I look back at the inequality that I'm using to graph, my inequality sign is greater than. So this tells me first that I'm going to have a dashed line that I can draw in, and then it also tells me that I'm going to, since it's greater than, I'm going to shade above. So I'm going to shade everything above the line on my graph.